Oh, it gives me the option to leave the meeting immediately. Perfect. All right. So, uh, over time, I've determined that I get far more nervous talking to people I know than talking to a crowd full of people I don't, because I can easily just zone out in the crowd. But you people, I have to see you again, so that's unfortunate. But I get a little shaky there. But that's also the coffee. So, so my story, I feel um, probably won't take a whole lot amount of time, but that's okay. We'll work through it and see what happens. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and me. That was truth. No. Growing up as a kid, I grew up in a Christian home. Grew up in church day one. You know, well, probably in the hospital day one, but church came shortly after. Not a whole lot to say, kind of similar. I mean, the more I learn about Joel, I'm pretty sure we're just the same person. So some of this might be plagiarized, but I'll try to put it in my own words and cite my sources if necessary. But I grew up in church, not a whole lot to say in my early years. I don't know when I ever actually accepted Christ, aside from, maybe like a Sunday school prayer that I don't remember, just being honest. It was kind of just a part of who I was. It was kind of an expectation on one hand, but also just an integral part of our family. We used to go to bed at night, and we used to pray before all our meals, which I don't do as much anymore. I have mixed thoughts on that, but that's not a big deal. I still try and pray every day. But we'd do the prayers religiously before meals. We'd do the prayers religiously at night. It would be either the Lord's Prayer, or it would be when we were younger, now I lay me down to sleep, that sort of thing. And it was just the idea of constantly praying and trying to thank God for the life he's blessed us with, and for each other and for family and friends and all that sort of thing. And I think every few nights my parents would have one of us pray individually. And it was an interesting experience. I was always the goody two shoes, so I had no problem with it. I just did the thing and moved on, and that's kind of how I lived a lot of my life. Still do. I mean, I'm a goody two shoes. That's fine. But so I look back on it a couple times throughout life and be like, I just kind of settled on 3 or 4. Like, that was the age that I gave my life to Christ. But can a 3 or 4 year old really do that, was a lot of the questions that I had. But at a certain point, I kind of determined that didn't really matter. It's not about when, it's about how, it's about the journey, it's about where I'm at now, and always growing. So the age became less of a thing as I grew up. But whenever it came time to tell your story, it was always like, oh, I don't have this crazy story, this background origin that I came from tragedy into triumph or anything like that. It was just kind of mundane. And so it always made things like this a little bit challenging. And I was I was homeschooled my whole life, not through college, obviously, but so I was homeschooled. So there's a unique sphere of people in homeschooling. Some live up to the stereotype, some don't. And I'll just leave that there. But there's definitely a certain stereotype that I do find a lot in homeschooling. And that is, there's a lot of fake it. Fake it till you make it, I think, or fake it till you don't. I think a lot of it was, you model after your parents, and, whatever kind of strict or lack thereof guidelines that they give you. Being maybe a little bit overly religious was seen as like golden child. And then if you didn't quite live up to those expectations, sometimes you were seen as the black sheep. And I, of course, fell somewhere close to golden child until maybe teenage years, because that was just, my nature. If you see childhood photos of me, I had little Coke bottle glasses lenses. I have horrible vision and played the part to perfection. But it was a unique experience. I did Awana as well. I have mixed feelings on it now, but I think that it does play a good part in all the Bible knowledge that I do have. I'm by no means an expert, but there's definitely a lot of things that have stuck with me over the years from that program, and a lot of good and bad experiences. But in those circles, there was a lot of homeschoolers in Awana too, and a lot of just those good Christian kids. Again, kind of just going through the motions. A lot of times when I look back over life, that's what it really was. I remember going to the camp, the summer camp over each summer, and one of them, I don't remember which one because that's how significant this event was to me apparently, but one of them, I decided to rededicate my life to Christ because I was just caught up in the emotions of the week. They kind of build you up and then send you home. You're on this emotional high, and I was like, yeah, I'm rededicating my life, and that lasted for about a week, and life goes on, and that's kind of how a lot of my journey went through my years. I did not prepare very well beforehand because I know that if I don't have it 100% prepared, I'm just going to be stressed. So I'm just winging it here. So I'm going to jump a little bit back and forth timeline wise to try and keep up. So very similar to what Joel said last week is that, well, I'll get there in a second. Never mind. I'll copy you later, Joel. It's fine. So a lot of times throughout, especially when I look back now, it's interesting that I never doubted Christianity. I never doubted the story of Christ. I never, even when I've had questions, I've never doubted the authenticity of what the gospel is. My questions have maybe been around interpretations of passages, or maybe around certain stories, whether the creation story is literal or poetry, things like that, whether certain things in the Bible are as severe as they say, or maybe whether certain things are actually more severe than we take them for. And in those questions, I don't think there was ever a time where I was like, this is going to make or break my faith. A lot of times I think my questions were, how does this fit into my faith? Which is interesting because I think this is where I copy Joel, is that I've never had any tangible speaking, relationship with God. I've never heard or even necessarily experienced God's voice or a direct guidance from God pretty much throughout my life until maybe recently, but I'll get into kind of how that's maybe not what you think. And that's been a really interesting thing for me. Growing up, again, it was a lot of going through the motions, memorizing verses for Awana. I had a Christian take on a lot of schooling since I was homeschooled. So it was, I was constantly exposed to scripture, at least at a surface level, at least, memorizing it, checking the boxes and moving on. But whenever it came to prayer, it's always been a challenge for me because it feels like a one-sided conversation. And a lot of times today it still does. And it's something I'm actually working on right now, but it's real interesting that going through all those motions, and when it felt like the time came where I really needed, something direct, it was kind of just as quiet, just as silent as the times where life was good. And what fascinates me to that point is that even through the silence, I've never doubted that God is there. And it's really a weird conundrum for me because I'm like, just looking back over life, I'm like, I'm praying, I'm talking to God, I'm asking for his direction in my life, and I'm getting nothing. But I know he's there. And if you think about that, that's so strange because I'm like, why do I know? And I have to ask myself, like, why is this not even a question when I'm getting nothing? Why is that not even a question when I'm, all I get is silence? And I look back over life, and I think God has been very good to me, way better than I've deserved. And some of the things that have worked out in my life, I just can't associate it to anything earthly. But at the same time, it's not like I ever got a whisper in the ear saying, go do this. So that's been an interesting experience for me. And it's brought about a lot of just personal struggles. And it's brought about conflicts with prayer and whether or not there's a point to it. And I know there is a point to it now, but over time I've drifted into an ebb and flow of whether or not I actually find it worthwhile. Growing up, I kind of was the nerdy goody two shoes, and then some point in the middle of the younger years, I was still nerdy and goody two shoes, but I was also just an angry child. I wasn't, breaking things or punching holes in walls or anything like that, but I was definitely, the kind of kid that in front of his friends, you're all cool, and in front of other, all the churchy places. But then at home, especially when the parents are gone, I'm sitting there screaming at my siblings and, causing a fuss and really just being way more angry than I needed to be. And then at some point in my teenage years, I decided that anger wasn't getting me anywhere. So I would just maybe go a little bit farther to the other extreme and just be completely chill about everything. And, that solved a lot of problems, but I think it also opened up other problems where I think relationships suffered with people because I kind of withdrawn myself so much that I wasn't angry anymore, but now I didn't have much to feel. I didn't have much to give out. And probably sometime in that period is also when, like most teenage boys, unfortunately, is when I also discovered pornography. And that was a real big struggle for years and years and years. Unlike Joel, when I prayed to have that struggle get taken away, nothing happened. It was the same silence. That was probably the biggest struggle of my faith journey, is that from, I don't know, maybe age 13 to maybe 21, 22, I don't know, sometime in that range, years of giving in, reeling back, repenting, going back, asking God to take it away. It shouldn't be that difficult. He can do anything. He can help me. And just the same silence over and over. And I knew that he would forgive me, but it was a very difficult number of years to deal with this burden that I thought I could stop at any time, and I was horribly wrong. I thought, oh, that's not an addiction, but it absolutely is, and it changes your brain, and those urges don't just go away, or at least not for me. Despite my pleading, despite me thinking I could just cut off cold turkey, despite all the things that I tried, virtually they all failed. And there were times where I'd go months and I thought I figured it out, and then it would be a relapse. And I look at it, I'm like, it is absolutely an addiction. And I know there's a lot of science to back that up now that I didn't know then. But that being one of the biggest struggles in my life, was a hard concept to grasp, that I knew this thing wasn't right. It wasn't good for me. It was causing me to go more inside myself because I was hiding a portion of myself from everyone. But then when I'd ask for help from, God, from the one who was supposed to be able to help me with these struggles and take away the pain and take my burdens, I was met with silence. And I think that caused me to fall into it even more, as a form of coping, because, once you have your fix, you feel better for a time and you move on, and then you wait until the next time. And that problem, like I said, took years, and there's no great ending to that story where it just magically went away. It was years of struggle and years of praying, and it all kind of culminated right about the time Amber and I started dating, and there was, some honest discussions with her and with, and I even mentioned it to my parents at one point that I was, putting it off, and maybe I think that accountability might have helped finish it off eventually, but it took so long to get there. And that brought about one of, like I said, the biggest struggles I ever had to manage in my life. And it's just talk about a feeling of lack of control, especially when you've become a person that you think is so controlled because you're not angry all the time anymore. You're not unleashing your emotions on people. And so you think that you have a good handle on yourself, and yet you're still falling into the same patterns of hopelessness in that one area. And it threw me for a loop for so long. But it's not all doom and gloom. I think really the last probably 5 years have been big growth years for me. And I still don't feel that in my prayers I ever receive, direct contact. And I know not everyone does, and I don't think that I have to. And it still doesn't impact my faith or my perception of God. I know that he speaks in other ways, and I'll get to that in a minute. But one of the things I've noticed over the last 5 years is that in one sense, I kind of have a blind faith because I've not had these crazy experiences that have told me otherwise. On the other hand, I've also kind of gone for an evidence-based approach. Not that my faith is purely dependent on what I can see and rationalize, but also I feel that there's just too much evidence to support scriptures, not even just scientifically, but just in the world around us. My personal mentality is that I can't look at the world and look at science and see it as a random chance and collection of things. And when I compare history, especially to the Old Testament, and then I compare historical facts to the New Testament, and at least the validity of it being an accurate document, accurately withheld over the years, those sorts of things help build me up and help reassure me that there's just, and this isn't, the best argument, this is going to sway someone one way or the other, but there's just no way to explain it. There's just nothing that stands up the same way. Experientially, I think some of the biggest things that I've noticed, especially when I started kind of trying to look for it, is that while I don't, hear a voice, and I don't get signs from heaven, and the clouds don't part on a rainy day and say, go over there, I've found that in a lot of situations, especially when, stresses become high, or even just anxiety, just telling me all sorts of things, there have been numerous occasions where I have, despite not feeling like I'm answered, I have, decided to take it to God in prayer. And while I don't get a solid answer one way or the other, I do find that I end up with a certain amount of peace that I don't think I can explain. And I know that the scripture would back me up on that. But it's a very weird thing. There have been some, for lack of a better word, crises in my life where I'm in emotional turmoil, and I hit a point where peace surrounds me, and it almost bothers me because I feel like I should still be emotional. I should still be in turmoil, but I'm not. And it doesn't bother me like I want to be in those things, but it bothers me that I feel like I should. I feel like, what's going to go wrong? Why do I feel this way? Because nothing's gone right yet. That's been a real interesting thing. And a lot of the ways that it's presented itself is actually through music. It's funny listening to Joel last week, because I also did not like music until I was probably in 6th or 7th grade. And I think I started to try to like music because I liked a girl who liked music, because people like music. But it was an interesting thing that I played two instruments that my mom, kind of not forced on me. Like I chose it, but it was also kind of not my choice because it was for school. I played saxophone and guitar for, years at that point without really caring for music that much. Even though I'd always been somewhat musically inclined, I just didn't enjoy listening to music. I would, just sit in silence for days on end. Like silence has always been my friend. And maybe that's why God's silent with me. I don't know. He knows that I like the quiet places, but through music and through just specific worship songs that the obscure ones that come to mind when that's not what I'm thinking of. Things like I think it's an old Starfield song, like when everything falls apart, your arms hold me together. And I remember that one popping up on a particular instance. And I was just like, why did I even think of that song? I haven't heard that song in like 3 years. It's not, every day on the radio. I don't listen to the radio anyway. I listen to my own music on Spotify, but it's just one of those things where I can't really explain why those sorts of things, come into my mind. And then when I play the song in my head, or I actually play it, through a speaker, it's almost instantaneous. As soon as the song would start, my mind would calm down. I would usually just fall into a rest, or sometimes just fall asleep with whatever was bothering me, and wake up at least somewhat renewed. And those are experiences that I think music is a powerful thing in and of itself, but I think that it's also definitely a gift from God that can't be overlooked. As far as church goes, like I said, I always went to church, and it kind of went from, oh yeah, we go to church, and then teen years, it kind of became, oh, I have to go to church. And then that kind of all led up to the point where I joined the worship team at Fair Oaks shortly before One Life was planted. And I've told this story, I think, in front of the congregation before, is that when Jeff asked me to come along with One Life and continue to play, that is probably the thing that kept me in church. I had seen my brother go, he used to go to a different church than us because he needed kind of his independence. And then that church had a bunch of drama, and he left church and hasn't really gone back since. And we've had a lot of discussions about that recently, but I had seen him do that. I was probably not too far behind. I was, just barely, I think, 18 at that point, old enough to choose not to go to church, I guess. And I probably would have. I probably would have just stopped going, or slowly at least faded away, if not for the few friends I had at the time, or, playing music. And so it's not necessarily the best reasons to stay in church, but if it kept me there, then it did its purpose. And that's continued to be a good thing for me. I think I'm kind of getting close to the end. I kind of saved this last point till the end. Speaking about the last 5 years, and specifically, even the last year or two, I've kind of found that as I've looked into why I've always felt that God was silent, I've looked into what else he might have been doing and how else he might have been communicating to me. Prayer is still a very hard thing for me, although I've discovered recently that you don't have to speak prayers and stumble through a prayer vocally. I've actually kind of taken to praying and writing, because I think actually Regina said it like a couple months ago. She said that she expresses herself better through writing. And I was like, me too. And that kind of sparked a thing in my head. I was like, there's nothing in the Bible that says that I can't write my prayers down as I think about this stuff and pray it to God. And it helps me be more honest, and it helps me just get the words out that I might stumble over if I'm trying to say things specifically. It also keeps me engaged, because when I'm praying vocally, my mind, or even mentally vocally, the voice in my head that thinks all things for me, if I'm praying that in my head, my mind wanders, and it takes me 10 minutes to realize that I'm not praying anymore. I'm thinking about something completely different. I'm like, oh, sorry, God, I'm coming back. And then I repeat the process until I fall asleep. That's kind of been my my prayers until I kind of realized that it doesn't have to be that experience. And I think that's really helped. And I'm still working on that. I don't do it every day, but I try. And I do. It's interesting. I've always had some slight constant communications with God. Without a formal like head bowing, arms crossed, eyes closed. I've had throughout life just I talk to myself a lot. I talk to myself a lot in my head, and I talk to myself a lot out loud when no one's around. So don't ever sneak up on me because I'm probably talking to myself. But and it's interesting that my mind does go to God quite often, and I even address Him with my crazy words to myself, and I do communicate just random thoughts to Him, and I think that's not a bad thing. I used to think I was a little crazy, but I don't think that's a bad thing. And so kind of pairing just that constant little tick and thought of God with expressing my thoughts in writing, I think has really come a long way. And I've kind of found through the last year or so that I got these two words that I thought of just before we started tonight, because that's how I do this. Dissonance and resonance. Those are my fancy words for the night. I've found that I think God talks to me through other people. And I think that's not uncommon. And it sounds a little, churchy at its core, but I'm not just talking about just any Joe Schmo speaking to me and I'm like, God told you to say that, right? No. But when you're having a deep conversation with someone, and I've had it a lot with Amber recently and a couple other people, where what they're saying, I'll start with the dissonance side of things. What they're saying is contrary to what my head wants, what I want. What they're saying is, my knee-jerk reaction is to say no. My knee-jerk reaction is to say, I don't agree. I don't necessarily think this is the right way of going about things. I, have this excuse, etc. So that's what my head says. But then, somewhere deep inside, I can literally feel that what they're saying is true, and it's what should happen, or what I believe intrinsically is true and a good thing. But my knee-jerk reaction is to say no. And for a long time, I think I let the knee-jerk take the lead, and I would just kind of say no, and I'd fight it until it went away, and then I wouldn't have to think about it anymore. But recently, I've kind of discovered that I have to sit there and actively push past the knee-jerk reaction and say, why is my heart telling me that this is correct while my brain says you don't want that? And I think I found that is one key thing to look for when the conflict is in myself. So it's not just someone saying something that's contrary to me, but when I'm actually having that internal conflict based on what they're saying. And then the other thing is resonance, where trying to avoid, confirmation bias. If someone says something to me that all parts of me agree with, and I know it's not for some selfish reason, and I can look at myself and say that this is a pure thing, that resonance, when it resonates with me like that, I think that, those two things, that a conflict with myself or when my whole self says yes, that I think those are the times that God is speaking to me. I wish that I could just, bow my head and pray and God would whisper in my ear and tell me everything I should do. And I think we all wish that. And while I've never experienced that, I don't need to. But now I look for that internal dissonance or that resonance with what fellow believers are saying, when we're having those hard-hitting issues, when we're talking about those deep subjects, that really, I think, hit me, and I think that's where God does his speaking. That brings us to present day, which is the end of this.